In this lecture, we have to talk about stories and historical narratives. A narrative is a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Historians use narratives to discuss what we know, how it is central to the past, and how we know it. And stories are a key way of understanding the past. The Rise of the West is a story. On the right here, you see the cover of a famous book by William H. McNeill called The Rise of the West. This is not the only story of the Rise of the West, and it's not necessarily the one that our narrative is based on, but it certainly plays a part in that narrative. Getting outside the Rise of the West narrative will help us accomplish three things. It will provide an independent way to tell which parts of the Rise of the West paradigm can be kept. It'll help students to think critically about their own assumptions and how the world works. And it will require us to consider how we know what we know about the world and history. But before we get into the narrative of the Rise of the West and our own historical narrative this semester, we have to understand three more concepts. Those concepts are the idea of contingency, the idea of accident, and the idea of conjuncture. Contingency. Contingency is dependence on chance or the fulfillment of a condition. Uncertainty, fortuitousness, nothing was left to contingency, nothing was left to chance, right? For example, railroads were possible in history only because of the invention of the steam engine. We can say that the development of railroads was contingent upon the invention of the steam engine. In other words, one depends upon the other in a cause and effect relationship. An accident is any event that happens unexpectedly, without a deliberate plan or cause. That the English industrialized first was due mostly to the fact that, by lucky accident, coal was easily available at ground level in England. And a conjuncture is a combination of circumstances. The development of railroads in England was due to a conjuncture, the invention of the steam engine, and the accident of easily available coal to fuel the steam engine, and poor roads meant a search for better transportation methods, a relatively highly paid workforce that made mechanization economically rewarding. All of these things contributed to the development of railroads. This is conjuncture. Given what we know about humanity and human history, and what we know about understanding cause and effect, it's important to start our narrative by recognizing our assumptions. There's no reason to think that Western dominance was inevitable in human history. So if we take a broader perspective in space and time, if we look at events in the world more generally, we can see that Western dominance did not really begin until at least 1750. And the West was not the most influential cultural system until perhaps as late as 1900. Development of the West was contingent upon changes in other parts of the world. First of all, we need to recognize that world trade was centered in Asia in the years before Columbus sailed to the Americas. Second, it's important to recognize that the formation and spread of Islamic empires was extremely successful, and much of it was based on trade. So we have at least two major civilizations that were non-European, that were undergoing historical change and having major effects on the world. In fact, in the 14th century, China and India were the source of most manufactured goods throughout the world. This is a picture of Indian textiles, which were popular throughout the world. And it's also important to recognize that Islamic empires blocked European access to India and China, making Europe kind of an outlier when it came to world trade networks. And if Europeans wanted to trade with the most prosperous trading networks in the world, they had to be able to trade with people who lived within these Islamic empires. In fact, it's that central position of the Islamic empires that eventually led Columbus and Vasco da Gama to try and solve this problem of European access to the center of world trade by trying to go around the Islamic world. As you can see on the left, Columbus's route, which took him ultimately to America, was an attempt to get to China and India by crossing the Atlantic Ocean. And Vasco da Gama's sail to India was successful in that it was an attempt to do just that, sail around Africa, get around the Muslim world, and sail directly to India, where he could trade with that prosperous trading network. So Europeans were attempting to join world trade. Eventually, discovery of silver in the New World led to the creation of the Atlantic triangular trade, which you can see on the right here. On the left is a picture of the silver mine at Potosi in Peru. But the Atlantic triangular trade, in which sugar, tobacco, and cotton from North America went to Europe, Europeans then traded textiles, rum, and manufactured goods to Africa for slaves, and then slaves were sent to the Americas to labor to gain sugar, tobacco, and cotton to send back to Europe. This triangular trade was one of the things that began to create the commodities for Europe that allowed Europeans to join world trade in the Indian Ocean. So what we see here is that the rise of the West was highly contingent upon other events which made it possible. Without those events, the West may not have come to dominate modern history at all. By 1750, Europe was catching up to Asia, and the world reached environmental limits. The invention of the steam engine and industrialization in Europe increased productivity, breaking those limits, and this happened first in England. So we'll look at that this semester. The contingent nature of the past is dependent on the contingent nature of the present. So one of the things that we have to recognize is that history is the opposite of inevitability. This means that, logically, if there are possibilities in the future, if we can make decisions as individuals or as societies and change how our society develops, then there must have also been possibilities in the past. That means that there were decision points in the past where things could have been quite different. History is not inevitable. So the subject of study of history is the understanding of the results of the choices humans made, learning the route we took to get where we are. It's important to recognize that accidents happen. And you can see here that one of the accidents that happened in Europe was the Little Ice Age. This Little Ice Age led Europeans to develop all kinds of changes in their society that were precursors on events that would come later, including Columbus's journey to the Americas and including the agricultural revolution. Coal, for example, was an accident. The distribution of coal deposits is accidental where humans are concerned, but this distribution is one of the key factors that explains why England's Industrial Revolution happened first. This, for example, is a coal seam in England. This dark area right here is a coal seam in a cliff, and I believe this is in Cornwall. And this is the area around the Forest of Dean, which some of you who've read Harry Potter may recognize as a location there. But within the Forest of Dean, a major coal deposit was there, and you can see that in England, coal deposits were visible on the surface easily accessible, at least initially. So this accident led to the Industrial Revolution in Europe. We also have historical conjunctures, that is, several independent developments interact with each other to create historical change. One of these conjunctures was the Chinese silver market and the New World. In the Ming period, from 1368 until 1644, Chinese main currency was unminted silver. That's what you see right down here is a Chinese silver ingot, which was used as money in China during this period. Well, as the Chinese population grew and the Chinese market grew, there wasn't enough silver to go around, making products extremely expensive. What was happening at the same time, however, was that, as you can see here, Europeans were developing silver mines in the Americas, and they were shipping that silver all the way to Asia, to Manila, where they would transload it and then ship it to China, where they would use it to buy silk. They would then send that silk to Japan, where Japanese would buy the silk again at higher prices, and then they would send it back to Manila and then send the remaining silver back through this route to Europe. Back through this route to Europe right here. So this trade is one of the key reasons why the world trade system became so global and why Europeans were able to join, because the Chinese needed silver, and because of their conquest of the New World, the Europeans had the silver. This made them players in the market, possibly for the first time. Another conjuncture is the idea of nation states and the fact of industrialization, which occurred at roughly the same time in the West, giving European states the power, both militarily and industrially, to conquer large parts of the world which were less industrially advanced than they were. But this also was based on the development of nation states, the European tendency to organize according to these small, somewhat different units than the empire units that most of the rest of the world had organized itself in politically for millennia. So these two things came together to make European colonies possible. In other words, it's important to recognize that in history we think about multiple causation. Nothing is ever caused by a single event. Instead, we look at causes in all kinds of areas. We try to understand causes in terms of the environment. We try to understand causes in terms of material goods and material needs of humans, wealth, and the things that we need to eat, build, and live in. We also look at methodological causes. How people go about doing what they're trying to do changes history, and the human causes, population growth, disease, the spread of disease, warfare, all kinds of different things that humans do or take part in eventually leads to various different effects. So there are multiple causes for every effect, and there are often multiple effects for every group of causes. So during this class, try to think in terms of multiple causation. And we'll be starting around 1400. Our look at the world really begins in the era around 1400, when we see changes in human history in terms of globalization, markets, and environment and politics that bring us to the edge of what we'll call modernity, and we'll look into what that is. So our goal is to look for an adequate paradigm, one that covers the developments and changes in the entire world and doesn't base everything simply on one region of the world as a focus for no other reason than that's where we come from. What we'll find is that many of the assumptions in Eurocentric views of the world are correct, but there are plenty that are not. And we'll find new assumptions and evidence from other parts of the world that help us to refine our paradigm to understand the development of the modern world as something beyond just westernization. This is often hard for us to deal with because we're trying to fit new ideas into an old system of thinking, when what we really need to do is expand our system of thinking to include the new ideas.